Queen Salotti of Tonga. And she'd melted. All the rain had melted her. And her hat hung down like spaniel's ears. And sitting opposite to her was a little man in a top hat and a morning coat, and he'd melted too. But she was beaming and smiling all over her face, and she was waving to everybody. The crowd went mad. They thought, what a marvellous woman. And so this man, he didn't know who she was, this friend of Noel Card's, and he said, no, extraordinary woman. Who on earth is that? And he said, oh, don't you know, my dear boy, that's the Queen of Tonga. He said, isn't she marvellous? Who's the little man sitting opposite to her? Noel Card said, her lunch. No. I then joined a thing called the Arts League of Service Travelling Theatre, which was a bus with all the scenery on the top of the bus and all the actors and actresses on the bottom of the bus. And we did a programme of 150 items, and they were able to choose 10 items wherever we went, a different place every single night. They chose 10 items, but 2 had to be extracts from the classics. And we stayed with the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker. You never knew who we were going to stay with. It was wonderful. And I learnt an enormous amount. It was directed by Donald Woolfit, the last tour. Great, great actor. I joined Brighton Repertory Company, where I was paid the grand sum of £3, 10 shillings per week. I lived in digs. They cost me 30 shillings, £1, 10 shillings, and I had 3 meals a day. Wonderful. I was walking down the street one day when I ran into an actor called Jon Pertwee, and Jon Pertwee said, you speak West Country, don't you? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, nip up to this studio in Bond Street. He said, go there. And he said, no, when you're in there, just say that I'm terribly sorry, I can't turn up today because I'm filming at Pinewood, and I've sent you instead. And so I went up, and the producer was furious. He said, what the hell's he talking? Who the hell does he think he is? He said, I don't just get people off the street. I said, no, as a matter of fact, I said, I am known to the son of the man who owns the company, and I can do the voice. He said, you can? I said, yes. He said, go on, do it. And so luckily it was a West Country farmer. Right, I said, that's no problem at all. There's a show called Marmaduke Brown, with Ernest Clark played the lead, played Marmaduke Brown. So I did it, and they said, yeah, that's all right. That's not bad at all. He said, you got the job. And so I did it, and I played the gardener in Marmaduke Brown. I rushed back home, and I phoned my agent, and I said, Morris? He said, yes. And I said, I've got good news. He said, oh, yes. And I said, Jon Pertwee, I met in the street. He said, yes, I know. And I said, and he sent me there, and I've got the job. He said, yes, I know. And I said, well, what else do you know? He said, I know that you've got every other job Mr. Pertwee does there. I said, what do you mean? He said, you're doing Mr. Reader, you're doing Stella Dallas, you're doing Young Widow Jones, you're doing all of them. That could make 25 programmes a week, and you're paid 2 guineas a programme. You're going to make a lot of money, young man. And I said, well, you don't sound very happy about this. He said, I'm not. And I said, why? He said, I handle Jon Pertwee as well. That was unfortunate, but I didn't care. And I worked on Radio Luxembourg more or less up to the start of the war. I was in a play called To Kill a Cat. Unfortunately, the producer was of a certain persuasion, which I wasn't, so he touched me up, and I said, don't do that. I said, because if you do, I'll knock you into the orchestra pit. And he did it again, and I knocked him into the orchestra pit. Not a good idea when you're starting off in the theatre. Not a good idea at all. He was injured, and so I was fired. I was expelled once again. And so I thought, well, what else can I do? I'll join the services. The war had started. And so I said, what am I going to join? I'm not going to join the Air Force. I'm too frightened to join the Air Force. How anybody could ever do what pilots did, I never know. The bravery of people getting into a plane and going out and flying over enemy territory night after night. Amazing courage. I wasn't going to join the army because I'd had nightmares about trenches and rats and bayonets and things, because I was born in 1919, just after the First World War, and so I thought, no, not for me. I'll join the Navy. Yes, because you're a long way away from the enemy. If you go into action, you're a long way away, and they might miss. And also, the food isn't bad. And also, of course, not to forget, all the nice girls love a sailor. I forgot that I was desperately seasick, even on the round pond. I was terribly seasick. And they put me into battle cruisers, and they put me into a ship called HMS Hood. And HMS Hood was the biggest battle cruiser in the British fleet. It did 42 knots. It weighed 43,000 tons. It had a complement of 1,768 men. And I was in Russian convoys. And believe me, that was tough. It was very cold. Seas, I promise you, that were 85 feet high, and that's no lie. And when you get 42,000 tons going whack, and you didn't go over the top, you went into the middle, and then it came out the other end, and then down on the sea, and spray would shoot over the ship, and I was in the spotting top. I was a spotter up in the spotting top, covered in about 18 overcoats, and about 7 hats and balaclava helmets. And when it went down like that and the spray went, I used to duck down quick because the water froze instantly and turned itself into icicles. And can you imagine a more ridiculous way of dying than being stabbed to death by an icicle? That would have happened, believe me. And we were up in Russian convoys, and then the Wolf-Pack submarines came out, because the spotting aeroplanes used to come round and round the Focke-Wulfs, go round and round and round. And our gunnery officer had a great sense of humour. And he was looking up at this aeroplane once we were off Murmansk and Archangel, and the plane was going round and round and round. And he said, "Hey, you up there, Fritz, for God's sake go round the other way, boy, you're making us dizzy." And we thought, that's a very funny man. And back came an answer from the German pilot, said, "Certainly, anything to oblige the British," and did. You would not believe it. In the early days, there was a certain sense of humour. They soon forgot all about the sense of humour after the war had been on a couple of years. Now, unfortunately, as you all probably know, the Hood came unstuck. She sailed into action against the Bismarck, the biggest battleship in the world, and the fastest, and the Hood was quick, but she'd had her magazine hatch covers made into very thin ones and make her light enough to catch the Bismarck, because she was quick. It was an unhappy ship because we never believed that it would take much of a whack, that it would probably explode. And what happened as we were closing in, I was a CW candidate, and which meant that I was an officer candidate. My captain had sent for me and said, "Tell me about Radio Luxembourg." And I said, "Oh, do you really want to know?" So he said, "Yes, I've always wanted to know. How do you do it?" And I told him for 20 minutes. He said, "Right, okay, that's lovely." And I said, "Excuse me, what was that all about?" He said, "Oh, you just passed a CW candidate's course thing. You know, that's your interview." I said, "Oh, thank you very much indeed, sir. Does that mean I can go?" And he said, "Yes, you can go." I didn't realize that when he said you can go, that I was going to be over the side of that ship. And I was down over grappling ropes, and I went down the netting, and I went into a drifter, and I was taken off to a ship called the Dunluce Castle, back at Scapa Flow. And the Hood just sailed on, and it got the first shell into the Bismarck. Bismarck then got the range of the Hood, and the awful thing was the third salvo landed forward of X turret, A, B, X, Y, and it went straight down through 2 wooden decks, hit the armoured deck, exploded, and because of these thin hatch covers, they just blew in, and the blast went down, hit the magazine, and whoosh, the ship exploded. It went down in 9.5 seconds. 1,768 men died, and 3 survived, leading seaman Tilburn, the midshipman Dundas, and signalman Briggs. This was a dreadful thing, and of course I was absolutely heartbroken about this, because I lost all my friends and my mates, and it was a dreadful thing to happen. And when I got back, all the letters from my parents had been returned saying the addressee of this envelope is missing, presumed killed. And so therefore when I arrived in the flat and opened the door and said, "Hi, Dad," he said, "Oh, no." My father's sense of humour. Well, we went then from then on survivor's leave, and I went down to Portsmouth Barracks as a CW candidate, and while I was at the CW candidate, I met up with a man called Chief Petty Officer Branch, who used to say, "Righto, lads, right, Mr. Down," and it was one of these people that everybody was frightened of. And he said, "Righto, come on in, Pee-wee, come here." "My God," he said, "get your bloody hair cut, you look like a bleeding chrysanthemum." And I corpsed, and I started to laugh. He said, "What are you laughing at?" And I said, "Well, you, sir." He said, what are you laughing at me for? I'm not supposed to be funny." I said, "Well, you are, sir. You're very funny." He said, "You're supposed to be frightened of me." And I said, "Well, I'm not, sir." He said, "Well, try, for Christ's sake." He said, "Right, get all these men and march down the end of the parade ground and turn them about." So I said, "Right, squad, by the left, quick, march," and off they went. And when they were gone about the length of this theatre, I said, "Squad, oh!" He said, "Well, what, you wait for it, I'll tell you when." And I said, "But can I?" He said, "I'll tell you when." And so they were disappearing, almost out of sight. And I said, "Squad!" He said, "Not yet. I'll tell you when." Oh, my God. And I really clutched the gluteals and said, "Squad! About turn!" Now, the men at the back heard me. They turned about. The ones in the middle thought I said right turn, and they went that way. The ones on the left went that way, and the ones in the front heard nothing, and they went straight on. "Oh, dear, oh, dear, oh, dear." He said, "Come on, get them back together, lad." And so I said, "Squad, about turn!" And this they all heard, and they all turned, and and Chief Petty Officer Branch said, "Yes. Well, now I know what they mean when they say Marines will advance in columns of fours and matelots in frigging great heaps." I love that man. Weeks later, I was in G Block in Portsmouth Barracks, and I was fire watching. And an incendiary bomb came through the roof, and I put a sandbag on the top, and I jumped on it to put it out, which is very stupid, because it went through the ceiling into the hammocks and started a raging inferno. And there were 6 of us up there, and we were going to be barbecued. And so I said, "Right, everybody out, lads," and they all went down the ladder, and I was the last out, and I looked to see if there were any more, and there weren't, so I came down the ladder. At that precise minute, the Germans dropped a landmine on a parachute at the end of the building. It blew up the regulating petty officers' block. It killed many RPOs. It blew the end of our building off. The blast came in, hit the wall, sucked me out, which blast does extraordinary things, and I went backwards through this mess room with the girders going over my head, and I went out of the hole at the end of the building and landed, bang, in the middle of all the rubble of the exploded and the blown up building. Well, I mean, I was in a terrible state. I was covered in blood, I was black, I was deaf, and when the men came round with the paddy wagons and with the stretchers, and they found me on the top of the building, obviously I was dead. So they picked me up and they put me on the stretcher, and they took me over to the officers' mess, and they took me into the mortuary, and the mortuary was the larder. They thought, what a good idea, you know, nice marble slabs, very good, we'll put all the dead in there. And so they put me on a slab in the larder of the officers' mess. I'd never been in the officers' mess before. And there I was on the larder, and I woke up and there was an arm hanging above me, and I pulled the arm. I said, "Oh," and the body went and fell on the floor. He was dead. And I said, "Hey, but wait," and the door opened, and a white-faced sick berth attendant came out and said, "Oh, gosh." I said, "Here, this man's dead." He said, "Blimey, mate, I thought you friggin' well was." And so they picked me up and they took me back to Haslar Hospital. And when I came out, I was ready for my CW candidates course. I was then going to be an officer at sea, I thought. But unfortunately, I couldn't add. I can't work without a calculator or fingers and toes. So when we had the exam papers, I was terribly neat. I drew a picture of a lovely galleon, and I got 3 marks for neatness, but nothing for navigation. So I said, "Please," I said, "don't send me back to sea, because I'll die. I can't be any longer at sea. I've done my sea time. Surely there must be something I can do as an officer." And so the captain, Captain Pelley, said, "Yeah, I suppose, all right, so we'll put you in special branch." And he put me in special branch, which you had special jobs, rather strange jobs. A French officer suddenly appeared, and I heard him talking to my divisional officer, and he said, where is he?" And he said, "Over there." And he came over and said, "You Pertwee?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Alors, vous parlez français, naturellement." I said, "Eh? What?" Never volunteer for anything, see. Nothing to do with French. Ooh, no, you know, with D-Day, no, keep well away from that, no. Do something in Scotland, no, France, no. And I said, no, je ne parle pas, c'est très mal. He said, "But in your papers it says that you are a French family, you naturally, you speak French." And he said, I said, no, I used to, but I don't anymore. So he said, "That's very..." He said, "That's very, very strange. I will talk to you later." I thought, I'm in the dead trouble here. And he went up and he spoke to a fellow called Rankin. And he said, "You are Rankin?" And he said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Vous parlez français?" He said, "Oui, je parle français. Oui, pas très bon, mais je parle." And I went, "Oh, my God." And he said, "Follow me, Rankin." And he went into the office. And he came out a few minutes later. And I rushed up to him and I said, "Tony, right, come on, tell me, what was the job?" He said, "Resident naval officer in Tahiti."